The wedding of Sarah Jensen and Mark Brewer was supposed to be the storybook culmination of a whirlwind romance, a perfect day of white lace and heartfelt vows in a charming rustic barn in the heart of Texas Hill Country. But the storybook ending devolved into a real-life horror story before the band ink on the marriage certificate was even dry. The wedding night, a night that should have been filled with tender intimacy and joyful discovery, ended in a confusion of blood, sirens, and a terrible, shocking secret. Less than 12 hours after saying "I do," Sarah Jensen was in a hospital emergency room, her beautiful wedding dress stained with blood, and her new husband was in police custody, his life and his carefully constructed identity about to be violently dismantled. The tragedy that unfolded in that honeymoon cabin was not the result of a sudden, violent argument. It was the catastrophic explosion of a secret so profound and so deeply guarded that its revelation could only end in devastation. Sarah Jensen was a woman who had always believed in love, even when it had given her little reason to. A kind-hearted, optimistic elementary school teacher from Austin, she had spent her 20s and early 30s navigating a series of disappointing relationships. There was the college boyfriend who was afraid of commitment, the charming musician who turned out to be a serial cheater, the stable but boring accountant who made her feel like a line item in his life's budget. At 34, she was beginning to feel a familiar, creeping sense of despair. All her friends were married, starting families, moving on to the next chapter of their lives. Sarah was still stuck in the prologue. She met Mark Brewer at a friend's backyard barbecue on a warm, spring evening. He was new to town, a software engineer who had recently relocated from California for a job at a burgeoning tech startup. He was handsome, in a quiet, unassuming way, with kind, steady blue eyes, a gentle smile, and a calm, reassuring presence. He wasn't the flashy, charismatic type she was usually drawn to. He was solid. They struck up a conversation over the grill, and Sarah was immediately charmed by his sincerity and his attentiveness. He asked her about her work, about her passion for teaching, and he listened, really listened, with an intensity that made her feel seen and valued. He spoke of his own life with a quiet, almost shy modesty. He had grown up in a small town in Northern California, raised by his mother after his father had died when he was young. He spoke of his love for hiking, for woodworking, for the simple, quiet pleasures of life. He seemed like a man who was utterly without artifice, a man who was comfortable in his own skin. He asked for her number at the end of the night, and he called her the next day. Their first date was a simple walk along the river, followed by coffee. The conversation was easy, comfortable, like they had known each other for years. Sarah found herself opening up to him in a way she rarely did with new people, telling him about her hopes, her fears, her past heartbreaks. He was a wonderful listener, empathetic and non-judgmental. Their romance progressed with a speed that was both exhilarating and, for Sarah, a little frightening. Mark was a man who knew what he wanted. After a month of dating, he told her he was falling in love with her. After 2 months, he told her he knew she was the one. "I've never felt this way before, Sarah," he told her one evening, his blue eyes full of a sincere, earnest emotion. "I feel like I've been waiting for you my whole life. I don't want to waste another minute." Sarah, who was used to men who were ambivalent and non-committal, was swept off her feet. Mark's certainty was a powerful aphrodisiac. He made her feel cherished, desired, the center of his universe. He was a traditionalist, a man of old-fashioned values. He would bring her flowers, open doors for her, and speak of their future together with a quiet, confident assurance. There was, however, one aspect of their relationship that was unusual. Mark was deeply religious, and he had a strong conviction about waiting for marriage. He had explained it to her early on, his tone serious and sincere. "I know this might sound old-fashioned, Sarah," he had said, holding her hands in his, "but my faith is very important to me. I believe that the physical side of a relationship is a sacred thing, something that should be shared only within the commitment of marriage. I know it's a lot to ask, but I hope you can understand and respect that." Sarah, who was not particularly religious herself, was taken aback. She had never been in a relationship where sex was off the table, But instead of seeing it as a red flag, she saw it as a testament to his character. In a world of casual hookups and fleeting connections, here was a man of principle, a man who valued emotional intimacy above physical gratification. His desire to wait made their connection feel even more special, more profound. It elevated their romance from a simple dating relationship to a noble, spiritual courtship. So, she agreed. Their relationship became one of chaste, romantic gestures. They would hold hands, cuddle on the sofa while watching movies, and share long, passionate kisses that were heavy with unspoken promise. The physical tension between them was immense, a tightly coiled spring of anticipation. Sarah found herself fantasizing about their wedding night, about the moment they would finally be able to consummate their deep, emotional love. The waiting, she told herself, would only make it more meaningful. After 6 months of this intense, chaste courtship, Mark proposed. He took her to the top of Mount Bonnell, overlooking the city of Austin, and got down on one knee with a simple, elegant diamond ring. His proposal was as heartfelt and sincere as everything else about him. He spoke of his love for her, of his desire to build a life with her, to be her partner, her protector, her husband. Sarah, weeping with joy, said yes without a moment's hesitation. The wedding planning began immediately. They decided on a short engagement. Why wait, Mark had argued, when they were so sure? They planned a beautiful, rustic wedding at a venue in the Texas Hill Country, a converted barn surrounded by rolling hills and ancient oak trees. Sarah's friends were thrilled for her. They adored Mark. He was everything they had ever wanted for their friend, kind, stable, successful, and utterly devoted to her. But some of them were privately perplexed by the no sex before marriage rule. "Are you sure about this, honey?" Her best friend, Jessica, asked her one afternoon while they were addressing wedding invitations. "I mean, it's a little weird, isn't it? In this day and age? What if you're not compatible?" "We're compatible in every other way," Sarah had replied, a little defensively. "Emotionally, intellectually, spiritually. The physical part, that will just be the icing on the cake. It will be perfect because we love each other so much." Jessica had dropped the subject, but a small seed of doubt had been planted. Sarah pushed it away. She was a romantic. She believed in the power of love to conquer all. And she was in love with Mark Brewer. The wedding day was perfect. The sun shone, the wildflowers were in bloom, and the rustic barn was decorated with fairy lights and mason jars filled with baby's breath. Sarah, in a beautiful classic lace gown, felt like she was living in a dream. As she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she saw Mark waiting for her at the altar, his eyes shining with tears. He looked so handsome, so earnest, so full of love for her. Any lingering doubts she might have had vanished. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, heartfelt promises of love, honor, and fidelity. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Mark kissed her, a long, passionate kiss that was met with the cheers and applause of their friends and family. The reception was a joyful, raucous affair. There was barbecue, beer, and a live country band. Sarah and Mark had their first dance, swaying together under the twinkling lights, lost in their own private world. Sarah felt a happiness so profound, so complete, that it almost hurt. This was it, the beginning of her forever. As the evening wound down, they prepared to leave for their honeymoon cabin, a secluded rental property nestled deeper in the hill country that Mark had booked as a surprise. Their friends and family sent them off in a shower of sparklers, their cheers and good wishes following them as they drove off into the warm Texas night. The drive to the cabin was filled with a giddy, nervous excitement. The anticipation that had been building for months was now a palpable, electric current in the car. Sarah could barely sit still. She kept looking over at Mark, at her husband, and her heart would do a little flip. The cabin was beautiful, a cozy, romantic retreat with a stone fireplace, a large, comfortable bed, and a hot tub on the back deck, overlooking a star-filled sky. Mark had arranged for champagne and chocolate-covered strawberries to be waiting for them. It was perfect. "Welcome home, Mrs. Brewer," he said, carrying her over the threshold in a grand, romantic gesture. He put her down, and she threw her arms around him, kissing him with all the pent-up passion of their chaste courtship. "I love you so much, Mark," she whispered. "I love you more," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. They drank a glass of champagne, their hands trembling slightly. The air was thick with unspoken desire. Finally, Mark took her hand and led her towards the bedroom. "I've waited so long for this," he said, his voice a low, husky whisper. Sarah's heart was pounding. This was the moment, the culmination of their perfect love story. She felt a mixture of nervousness and intense excitement. She had built this moment up in her mind for so long, a fantasy of perfect, transcendent intimacy. In the soft, dim light of the bedroom, they began to undress each other, their movements a little clumsy, a little awkward, fueled by months of anticipation. Sarah's hands shook as she unbuttoned his shirt. He kissed her neck, her shoulders, his touch sending shivers down her spine. She was in a state of pure, blissful arousal. She lay back on the bed, her body open and ready for him, her heart overflowing with love and desire. He moved on top of her, his body heavy and warm. She closed her eyes, ready for the final physical consummation of their love. She waited and waited. Nothing happened. She opened her eyes. Mark was lying on top of her, his face buried in the pillow next to her head, his body still. He was breathing heavily, but he wasn't moving. "Mark?" she said, her voice a little confused. "Honey, are you okay?" He didn't answer. He just lay there, a dead weight on top of her. A flicker of concern, then annoyance, went through her. Was he drunk? They had only had a few glasses of champagne at the reception. Was he just nervous? That was understandable. "It's okay, honey," she said, trying to keep her voice soft and reassuring. She ran her hand down his back. "We have all the time in the world. There's no pressure." He finally rolled off her, turning his back to her without a word. He lay on his side, his body rigid, his shoulders hunched. The silence in the room was suddenly deafening. The romantic, charged atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a cold, awkward tension. Sarah sat up, pulling the sheet around her. "Mark, please talk to me," she said, her voice pleading. "What's wrong? Did I do something? Is it me?" "It's not you," he mumbled into his pillow, his voice muffled. "Then what is it?" she asked, her confusion turning to frustration. "We've waited for this for so long. I thought you wanted this." "I do," he said, his voice tight with an emotion she couldn't identify. "Then what's the problem?" she pressed, her patience wearing thin. "If you're nervous, that's fine. But you have to talk to me. We're married now. We're supposed to be able to talk about anything." He remained silent, his back a rigid, unmoving wall. Sarah felt a surge of anger. This was not how her wedding night was supposed to go. She had been patient, she had respected his beliefs, she had waited. And now, he was shutting her out, refusing to even talk to her. "This is ridiculous, Mark," she said, her voice rising. "I'm your wife. You can't just turn your back on me and refuse to talk. Whatever it is, we can deal with it together. But you have to tell me what's wrong." She reached out and put her hand on his shoulder. "Talk to me," she said, her voice softening again. He flinched at her touch, pulling away as if he had been burned. "Just leave it alone." "Sarah," he said, his voice a low, angry growl. "No, I will not leave it alone," she said, her anger flaring again. "This is our wedding night, and you are acting like a child. What is so terrible that you can't even tell your wife?" She grabbed his shoulder and tried to turn him towards her. "Look at me, Mark." He resisted, his body tense. She pulled harder, and in the struggle, the sheet that was covering him slipped down, and Sarah saw it. She saw the reason for his silence, for his shame, for his strange, chaste courtship. She saw the secret he had been hiding. In the flaction, place where his manhood should have been, there was nothing. Just a smooth, unnaturally flat expanse of skin, crisscrossed with a network of faint, silvery scars. It was the landscape of a body that had been surgically, irrevocably altered. Sarah stared, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. It was a physical impossibility, a biological anomaly that her brain could not comprehend. She let go of him, scrambling back on the bed, away from him, her hand flying to her mouth. Mark, realizing she had seen, let out a sound that was a mixture of a sob and a roar of pure, animal anguish. He quickly pulled the sheet back up, hiding his body, hiding his secret. But it was too late. She had seen. "What? What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock, confusion, and a dawning, horrified understanding. He sat up, his back to her, his shoulders shaking. He didn't answer. "Mark, what happened to you?" she asked, her anger replaced by a wave of bewildered pity. Was it an accident? A birth defect? He finally turned to face her. His face, the kind, gentle face she had fallen in love with, was contorted into a mask of pure, agonizing shame and rage. His blue eyes, usually so steady and calm, were wild with a desperate, cornered animal terror. "It's none of your business," he hissed, his voice a venomous spray. "None of my business?" she cried, her own shock now turning back to anger. "I'm your wife. We just got married. And you have been hiding this from me? This whole time? The waiting for marriage, the religion? Was it all just a lie to cover this up?" The accusation hit him like a physical blow. His face crumpled. "It wasn't a lie," he whispered, his voice broken. "I do love you. I couldn't tell. I was afraid you would leave me. You thought you could just marry me and I would never find out," she exclaimed, the absurdity of it all hitting her with full force. "You thought we could just have a life together and this would never come up? What did you think was going to happen? Tonight, Mark? What was your plan?" He had no answer. He just stared at her, his face a canvas of shame and despair. He had no plan. He had been living in a fantasy, a desperate, impossible hope that his love for her and her love for him would somehow magically make his secret disappear. He had believed that the act of marriage itself, the sacred vow, would somehow heal him, make him whole. Sarah looked at him, at this man who was a complete stranger to her, and the entire foundation of their relationship crumbled into dust. The love, the trust, the shared future, it was all built on a lie of omission so profound, so fundamental, that it negated everything else. She was not his wife. She was a prop in his desperate, tragic play. "I can't do this," she said, her voice flat and dead. She swung her legs off the bed and stood up, grabbing her clothes from the floor. "I can't be married to you. I can't be married to a liar." "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice rising in panic as he saw her getting dressed. "I'm leaving," she said, pulling on her jeans, her hands shaking. "I'm calling a cab. I'm going to a hotel, and in the morning I'm calling a lawyer. This marriage is over." "No," he said, a new, dangerous edge to his voice. He stood up, pulling the sheet around his waist like a toga. "You can't leave. You can't tell anyone." "I can and I will," she said, her fear making her defiant. "You can't keep a secret like this, Mark. You can't lie to someone like this and expect there to be no consequences." She grabbed her purse and her phone and headed for the door. He moved to block her path. "Sarah, please," he begged, his face a mess of tears and desperation. "Don't do this. We can work it out. I love you." "Love?" she laughed, a short, bitter, hysterical sound. "You don't know the first thing about love. Love is about honesty. Love is about trust, and you have destroyed all of it. Now, get out of my way." She tried to push past him. He grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "You are not leaving," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. The kind, gentle man was gone. In his place was a desperate, cornered animal, his eyes wild with a terror that was quickly turning to rage. "Let go of me," she screamed, struggling against his grip. "You're going to tell everyone," he hissed, his face close to hers. "You're going to humiliate me. You're going to tell them my secret. You brought this on yourself," she cried, trying to wrench her arm free. His control snapped. The lifetime of shame, of secrecy, of fear erupted in a single violent explosion. He was not thinking, he was just reacting. a primal, desperate attempt to silence the person who now held the power to destroy him. He shoved her, hard. Sarah stumbled backward, her feet tangling in the rug. She fell, her head hitting the sharp corner of the heavy oak bedside table with a sickening cracking sound. She collapsed to the floor in a heap, a dark, spreading stain beginning to form in her beautiful blonde hair. Mark stood over her, his chest heaving, his mind a screaming void. He stared at her still, silent form, at the blood pooling on the floor. The shame, the fear, the rage, it all evaporated, replaced by a new, all-consuming terror. What had he done? He had guarded his secret his entire life, and now, in a desperate attempt to protect it, he had committed an act so terrible, so final, that his secret would be the first thing the world would learn about him. He had not silenced the truth. He had just amplified it with a scream of violence that would echo for the rest of his life. For a long, silent moment, Mark Brewer was paralyzed. The world had narrowed to the scene at his feet, his new wife, his bride of less than 12 hours, lying motionless on the floor of their honeymoon cabin, a halo of blood spreading from her head. The sound of her skull hitting the oak table echoed in his mind. A sharp, definitive crack that had severed their future and shattered his life. The panic that seized him was a physical force, a cold, crushing weight in his chest. He knelt beside her, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken sound. "Sarah, wake up, please." He reached out a trembling hand and touched her neck, searching for a pulse. He found one, faint and thready, but it was there. She was alive. The relief was so overwhelming it almost brought him to his knees, but it was immediately followed by a new wave of terror. She was alive, but she was gravely injured. She needed a hospital. He had to call 911. But what would he say? "My wife and I had a fight on our wedding night because she discovered my secret, and I pushed her, and she hit her head." The words were a confession. The moment he made that call, his life as he knew it would be over. The secret he had guarded with such fierce, desperate energy would be laid bare for the world to see, not in a quiet, compassionate conversation, but in a stark, humiliating police report. He would be a freak, a monster, the man who had maimed his wife on their wedding night because of his own grotesque inadequacy. He looked at Sarah's pale, still face, and then around the cozy, romantic cabin, the champagne bottle, the strawberries, the flickering fireplace. It was all a stage set for a play that had ended in a brutal, unplanned tragedy. He had to rewrite the ending. He had to create a new story. It was an accident. The thought, born of pure, selfish terror, took root in his mind. A terrible, tragic wedding night accident. She had been drinking. She was excited, happy. She had tripped and fallen. Yes, that was it. A simple, believable tragedy. His mind, which had been a screaming void, was now sharp and focused, the mind of a software engineer debugging a catastrophic system failure. He had to identify the variables, control the inputs, and produce a desired outcome. The desired outcome was his own survival. First, the scene. It needed to look like an accident, not a struggle. He looked at Sarah's body. She was lying too close to the bedside table, the point of impact too obvious. He, gently, carefully, moved her body a few feet away, towards the center of the room. He rearranged her limbs, trying to make her position look more like a natural fall. Next, the cause. A trip. He looked around the room. The rug. He kicked at the edge of the thick plush area rug, creating a small, rumpled fold. That was it. She had caught her heel on the rug. The alcohol. He took the half-empty bottle of champagne and poured a small amount onto the floor near her body, as if a glass had been spilled in a moment of giddy celebration. He then took her champagne flute and placed it on the floor near her hand, as if it had slipped from her grasp as she fell. His own state. He had to be the distraught, grieving husband. He splashed some water on his face, ran his hands through his hair to make it look disheveled. He looked at himself in the mirror. His eyes were wide with a genuine terror, which he hoped would be mistaken for grief. The timeline. He looked at the clock. It had been almost 15 minutes since she had fallen. The delay was dangerous, but he could explain it. He had been in shock. He had tried to help her himself before calling for help. He took a deep, shuddering breath, a performer preparing to take the stage. He picked up his phone and dialed 911. His voice, when he spoke, was a masterpiece of feigned hysteria. "Help," he gasped. "My wife. She's had an accident. It's our wedding night. She fell. She hit her head. She's bleeding. I don't think she's breathing." He added the last part for dramatic effect, a detail to underscore his panic. The operator's calm, professional voice was a jarring anchor in his swirling chaos. She took his address, told him to stay on the line, and assured him that help was on the way. Mark continued his performance, sobbing, pleading, asking what he should do. He knelt by Sarah's side, putting the phone on speaker, so the operator could hear his frantic, whispered pleas for her to wake up. The first to arrive were the local volunteer paramedics, their faces grim as they took in the scene. The beautiful bride in her blood-stained dress, the distraught husband, the romantic cabin turned into a scene of tragedy. They worked quickly, stabilizing Sarah's neck, getting her onto a backboard, their movements efficient and professional. Then the sheriff's deputies arrived. Mark, his face a mask of anguish, launched into his rehearsed story. "We were celebrating," he said, his voice breaking. "We were so happy. She was dancing. She had a little too much champagne. She tripped on the rug. She fell and hit her head on the floor. I tried to wake her up. I didn't know what to do." One of the deputies, a man with a weathered face and tired, skeptical eyes named Deputy Miller, listened patiently. He had seen a lot of domestic accidents in these remote honeymoon cabins. He had also seen a lot of domestic violence. Something about Mark's story, his slightly too perfect performance of grief, the neatness of the accident scene, felt off. "She hit her head on the floor, you said?" Miller asked, his voice casual. "Yes," Mark said quickly, "the hardwood floor." Miller glanced at the heavy oak bedside table, at its sharp, unforgiving corner. Then he looked at the location of the head wound, a deep, crescent-shaped gash that seemed to match the corner of the table perfectly. The floor was hard, yes, but it was flat. It wouldn't make a wound like that. The paramedics loaded Sarah into the ambulance. Mark tried to go with her, but Deputy Miller put a firm hand on his shoulder. "We need you to stay here, sir," he said, his voice polite but firm. "We just need to ask you a few more questions. Standard procedure." Mark's heart seized. This was not part of the plan. He was supposed to be at the hospital, playing the part of the worried husband. But he had no choice. He sat at the small kitchen table while Miller and his partner asked him to go over the story again. He repeated it, trying to keep the details consistent, his voice trembling with what he hoped sounded like grief, not fear. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Sarah was rushed into the emergency room. The doctors discovered she had a severe skull fracture and a significant subdural hematoma. She was alive, but her condition was critical. She was taken immediately into surgery to relieve the pressure on her brain. As the ER team worked on her, a nurse, following standard procedure for any traumatic injury involving a woman, conducted a physical examination. She noted the severe head trauma, but she also noted something else, something that was not on the initial report from the paramedics. There were fresh, angry bruises on Sarah's upper arm, bruises in the distinct shape of fingers, the kind of bruises left by someone grabbing her hard. The nurse documented her findings and reported them to the attending physician, who in turn notified the police. Back at the cabin, Deputy Miller received the call from the hospital about the bruises. He looked at Mark, who was still sitting at the table, wringing his hands, the picture of anguish. "Mr. Brewer," Miller said, his voice losing its polite edge. "The hospital found bruises on your wife's arm, bruises that looked like she was grabbed. Can you explain that?" Mark's blood ran cold. The struggle. He had forgotten about the struggle. I grabbed her when she was falling," he stammered, the lie coming to him in a flash of panicked inspiration. "I tried to catch her. I must have bruised her. I didn't mean to." It was a plausible lie, but it was another crack in his story. Miller's skepticism hardened into suspicion. "We're going to need you to come down to the station, Mr. Brewer," he said, his tone no longer a request. "We need a formal statement." The drive to the sheriff's station was a silent, terrifying journey into a future Mark had never imagined. He was placed in a small, windowless interview room, the air stale with the scent of old coffee and fear. He sat there for hours, his mind racing, trying to find the flaws in his story, trying to patch the holes. He was a man who had built his life on a foundation of control. He had controlled his secret, controlled his relationships, controlled the narrative of his own life. Now, he was in a place where he had no control, and he was beginning to unravel. Finally, Deputy Miller and a detective from the county's major crimes unit entered the room. The detective, a woman named Detective Chen, had a sharp, intelligent face and eyes that seemed to see right through him. They went over his story again and again. They asked the same questions in different ways, probing for inconsistencies. Mark stuck to his script, the story of the tragic fall, the spilled champagne, the attempt to catch her. But his performance was wearing thin. His grief was beginning to look like fear, his anguish like guilt. "Let's talk about your marriage, Mark," Detective Chen said, her voice calm and even. "You'd only known each other for 6 months. That's a fast courtship." "When you know, you know," Mark said, repeating the cliché he had used so many times before. "We were in love." "So in love that you waited until marriage to be intimate?" Chen asked, her question casual, but her eyes sharp. Mark froze. This was the territory he had been dreading. "We're both traditional," he said, his voice tight. "We believe that sex is a sacred part of marriage." "So, last night was the first time?" Chen pressed. "Yes," he said, his throat dry. "And how was it?" she asked, her voice still maddeningly calm. The question was a grenade. He didn't know how to answer. If he said it was wonderful, it would contradict the argument he had claimed they had. If he said it was bad, it would open a door he desperately needed to keep closed. "It was private," he finally said, his voice a low whisper. "Mark," Chen said, leaning forward, her voice softening. "We're not here to judge you. We just want to understand what happened in that cabin. Sometimes, on a wedding night, there are expectations, pressures. Sometimes, things don't go as planned. Sometimes, people get disappointed. They get angry. Fights happen. We understand that. We just need you to be honest with us." She was giving him an out. A way to confess to a lesser crime, a crime of passion, a fight that had gone horribly wrong. For a moment, he was tempted. The weight of his lie was becoming unbearable. But then he thought of the secret. Confessing to a fight would mean explaining the reason for the fight. And that he could not do. The humiliation was a fate worse than prison. "There was no fight," he insisted, his voice hardening. "She fell. It was an accident." Detective Chen sighed. She had seen this before. The stubborn denial of a guilty man. She stood up. "Okay, Mark. We're going to hold you for now. We have a lot more questions. And we're going to be talking to your wife as soon as she's able to speak." The thought of Sarah waking up, of her telling them the truth, was a new, terrifying prospect. He'd been so focused on the immediate aftermath, he hadn't thought about that. He had to hope that the injury was severe enough to cause amnesia, that she wouldn't remember. It was a monstrous thought, to hope for his wife's brain damage, but his survival instinct had overridden everything else. He spent the night in a cold, concrete holding cell. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent his entire life in a prison of his own making, a prison of secrecy and shame. Now, he was in a real one. The next morning, the news about Sarah's accident reached her family and friends. Her best friend, Jessica, was one of the first to arrive at the hospital. She found Mark in the waiting room, his head in his hands, performing his role as the distraught husband. "Oh my God, Mark, what happened?" Jessica cried, rushing to his side. He repeated his story, the story of the fall, the champagne, the tragic accident. Jessica listened, her face a mask of horror and sympathy. But as he spoke, a small, nagging doubt began to form in her mind. She remembered her conversation with Sarah about Mark's insistence on waiting for marriage. She remembered the flicker of doubt in Sarah's own eyes. Something about this perfect, tragic story felt wrong. Sarah remained in a medically induced coma for 2 days. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. The surgery had been successful in relieving the pressure on her brain, but the extent of the long-term damage was still unknown. Mark waited at the hospital, a constant, somber presence. He was the perfect, grieving husband, accepting the condolences of friends and family, his face a study in sorrow. But the police were building their case. The forensic team had finished their analysis of the cabin. They confirmed what Deputy Miller had suspected. The blood spatter patterns were inconsistent with a simple fall. They indicated a forceful impact against the bedside table. They also found no evidence of a slip or a trip. The rumpled rug was a clear amateurish piece of staging. The case was officially reclassified from an accident to an aggravated assault. On the 3rd day, Sarah began to stir. The doctors slowly reduced her sedation, and she began to drift back towards consciousness. Mark was in the room when her eyes fluttered open. "Sarah," he said, his voice a mixture of hope and terror. "Honey, can you hear me?" Her eyes, hazy and unfocused, slowly moved to his face. For a moment, there was no recognition. And then, her expression changed. The fogginess cleared, replaced by a look of pure, undiluted terror. She tried to speak, but only a hoarse, croaking sound came out. She tried to shrink away from him, her body tensing, her eyes wide with a primal fear. A nurse, seeing her distress, rushed into the room. "Mr. Brewer, I think you should leave," she said firmly. "You're agitating her." Mark was escorted from the room, his heart pounding. She remembered everything. Detective Chen was at the hospital within the hour. She sat by Sarah's bedside, her voice calm and gentle. Sarah was weak, her speech slurred, but she was lucid. "Sarah," Chen said softly, "can you tell me what happened? Can you tell me how you got hurt?" Tears began to stream down Sarah's face. With a pained, halting voice, she began to speak. She told Chen everything: the wedding night, the anticipation, the confusing, disappointing encounter. And then, the discovery. She described the smooth, scarred skin where his manhood should have been. She described his shame, his rage, and she described the fight. "He didn't want me to leave," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He didn't want me to tell anyone. He grabbed me. I tried to get away. And he pushed me. He pushed me so hard." It was the confirmation they needed. The story, as bizarre and shocking as it was, fit the evidence perfectly. It explained the bruises, it explained the nature of the head wound, and it explained the motive, a motive so strange and so powerful that it had driven a seemingly gentle, kind man to an act of brutal violence. Armed with Sarah's statement, the police arrested Mark Brewer for attempted murder. The charge was later upgraded when the full, shocking medical truth behind his secret was revealed. The investigation into Mark's past uncovered a life built on a foundation of profound medical and psychological trauma. He had been born with a rare congenital condition known as aphalia, a condition where a male is born without a penis. At a young age, he had undergone a series of complex, experimental surgeries designed to construct a phallus. The surgeries had been a failure, leaving him not with a functioning organ, but with a landscape of scar tissue and a deep, abiding sense of shame and inadequacy. His father, unable to cope with the imperfection of his son, had abandoned the family when Mark was a child. His mother, a deeply religious and overprotective woman, had raised him in a bubble of secrecy and shame. She had taught him that his condition was a cross to bear, a private, terrible secret that he must never reveal to anyone. He had spent his entire life hiding. He avoided situations where his body might be exposed: swimming pools, gym locker rooms. He had never had a real, intimate, relationship. He had become a master of deflection, of creating a persona of a quiet, traditional, deeply religious man to explain his lack of a romantic history and his desire for a chaste courtship. He was not a software engineer who happened to be religious. He was a man whose entire religious Identity was a construct, a shield to protect his terrible secret. He had met Sarah, and for the first time, he had fallen in love. He had allowed himself to believe in a fantasy where the power of their emotional connection would somehow transcend the reality of his physical body. He had hoped that the act of marriage, the sacred vow, would be a kind of miracle, a way to finally be seen and accepted as a whole person. But he had no plan for the reality of the wedding night. He had simply hoped for the best. A desperate, magical thinking that had led him to a moment of unbearable exposure. When Sarah discovered his secret, his entire world, his entire carefully constructed identity, collapsed. The shame was not just about his body, it was about the lie he had been living his entire life. His violent act was not born of a desire to harm Sarah. It was born of a desperate, primal need to silence the truth, to kill the secret that had just been exposed. He had not been trying to kill his wife. He had been trying to kill his own shame. The trial was a quiet, somber affair. The sensational details of the case were kept from the public to protect Sarah's privacy. Mark, on the advice of his lawyer, pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of aggravated assault. His defense was a tragic story of a lifetime of trauma, of a man broken by a secret he could no longer bear. Sarah was in the courtroom for his sentencing. She had spent months in physical and emotional recovery. Her physical wounds were healing, but the psychological scars were deep. The man she had loved, the man she had married, was a stranger, a tragic figure whose lies had almost cost her her life. She looked at him as he stood before the judge, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of defeated resignation. She felt not hatred, but a profound, weary sadness. He was not a monster. He was just a broken man, a man so consumed by his own shame that he had destroyed everything he had ever wanted. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in prison. As he was led away, he looked at Sarah one last time. His eyes, the kind, steady blue eyes she had fallen in love with, were filled with a sorrow so deep, so profound, that it was almost unbearable to look at. It was the look of a man who had not just lost his freedom, but had lost his one and only chance at a life free from the prison of his own secrets. The wedding night had ended in blood, not because of a lack of love, but because of a truth that was, in the end, too terrible to be spoken and too powerful to be contained. The aftermath of the trial was not an ending, but the beginning of a long, quiet, and difficult epilogue for everyone involved. The sensational headlines faded, and the story of the wedding night that ended in blood became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the small towns of the Texas Hill Country. But for Sarah Jensen and Mark Brewer, the echoes of that night would reverberate for the rest of their lives. Mark's time in prison was a study in quiet, monastic solitude. He was a model prisoner, just as he had been a model employee and a model fiancé. He followed the rules, kept to himself, and never caused any trouble. The brutal, hierarchical world of prison, with its constant threat of violence and exposure, should have been a living nightmare for a man with his secret. But in a strange, tragic way, the prison walls were just a physical manifestation of the emotional prison he had lived in his entire life. He had always been hiding, always been on guard. The constant, low-grade terror of prison was a familiar feeling. He refused all visitors except for his mother. Her visits were painful, stilted affairs, filled with long silences and the heavy, unspoken weight of their shared secret. She never spoke of his crime, nor of his condition. She would talk about the weather, about the goings-on at her church, about anything and everything except the truth. To her, his incarceration was just another chapter in the long, tragic story of the cross he had to bear. Another layer of shame to be hidden from the world. Mark never spoke of Sarah. He never uttered her name. In his mind, she had become a sacred, untouchable memory. The one beautiful, perfect thing in his life that he had, with his own hands, destroyed. The love he had felt for her was real, perhaps the only truly real emotion he had ever allowed himself to feel. And the guilt of what he had done to her was a silent, constant companion, a punishment far more profound than any sentence a judge could impose. He had spent his life terrified of being exposed, and in the end, he had exposed himself as a monster to the only person whose contents, opinion had ever truly mattered. Sarah's recovery was a journey through a landscape of pain, both physical and psychological. The head injury left her with lingering issues, chronic headaches, dizzy spells, and a frustrating, intermittent aphasia that would sometimes steal words from her just as she was about to speak. She had to go through months of intensive physical and cognitive therapy. She had to relearn how to trust her own body, her own mind. But the physical healing was the easy part. The emotional wounds were deeper, more complex. The betrayal she had experienced was so fundamental, so absolute, that it had shattered her perception of reality. How could she ever trust her own judgment again? She, the kind, optimistic woman who prided herself on her ability to see the good in people, had fallen in love with a ghost, a carefully constructed fiction. She had married a man she did not know at all. She was haunted by the what-ifs. What if she had listened to her friend's doubts? What if she had insisted on a more conventional courtship? What if, on that terrible night, she had reacted with compassion instead of anger when she discovered his secret? The guilt of that last question was a particularly heavy burden. She knew, logically, that his violence was his own, a product of his own trauma. But in the dark, quiet hours of the night, she would wonder if a different reaction from her might have led to a different outcome. She sold the house she had bought with such hopeful dreams of a future with Mark. She quit her job at the elementary school, the constant presence of happy, intact families, a painful reminder of the life she had lost. She moved to a small, anonymous apartment in a different part of Austin, trying to disappear, to become someone else. Her friends, especially Jessica, rallied around her. They were her lifeline, her connection to a world that still made sense. But even with them, she felt a sense of distance. They could not possibly understand the bizarre, specific nature of her trauma. How do you explain to someone that your fairy tale romance ended because of a secret so strange it sounds like something from a medical textbook? How do you explain the profound, mind-bending confusion of discovering that the man you love is, in a fundamental physical way, not the man you thought he was? For a long time, she was consumed by anger. Anger at Mark, for his profound deception. Anger at his mother, for wrapping him in a cocoon of shame instead of getting him the psychological help he so desperately needed. And anger at herself, for being so naive, so desperate for her own happy ending that she had ignored the subtle red flags. But as the years passed, the anger slowly, gradually, began to fade, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. She began to see Mark not as a monster, but as a tragic, broken figure, a victim of his own body, and of a society that has such rigid, unforgiving definitions of what it means to be a man. She saw that his lie was not born of a desire to hurt her, but of a desperate, lifelong need to be loved, to be seen as normal. His crime was unforgivable, but his pain, she began to realize, was real. This shift in perspective was the beginning of her own true healing. She started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma. She began to write, to pour her story, her confusion, her grief, and her anger onto the page. It was a way of making sense of the senseless, of imposing a narrative order on the chaos that had been her life. After serving 7 years of his 10-year sentence, Mark Brewer was released from prison on parole. He was a man in his early 40s, his quiet handsomeness now etched with the permanent, weary sadness of a man who had lost everything. He did not return to the world of software engineering. He took a Dinge Revengeance, quiet, anonymous job as a warehouse stocker, a job where he could be invisible. He lived in a small, sparse apartment, his only companion the ghost of the life he had almost had. One day, about a year after his release, a package arrived at his apartment. There was no return address. Inside was a single paperback book. The title was The Unspoken, and the author was Sarah Jensen. His hands trembled as he opened it. It was her story, their story. It was a novel, a work of fiction, but the details were all there, thinly veiled but unmistakable. She had changed the names, the locations, but the heart of the story, the chaste courtship, The wedding night, the terrible secret, the violent aftermath. It was all there. He read it in a single, breathless sitting. He read about the woman's loneliness, her desperate hope for love. He read about her falling for the kind, gentle, traditional man. And then he read about her discovery and her reaction. But in the book, Sarah had given the character a different reaction. In the book, the woman, after her initial shock and anger, found a sliver of compassion. She did not run, she stayed, she talked. The story did not end in blood and sirens. It ended in a quiet, painful and honest conversation, followed by a sad, mutual and peaceful annulment. It was the ending that should have been. It was the ending that his real-life actions had made impossible. At the back of the book was an author's note. In it, Sarah wrote about the themes of the novel, the destructive power of secrets, the societal pressures of masculinity, and the profound human need for acceptance. She wrote about the importance of compassion, both for others and for oneself. And then, the final lines of the note. This is a work of fiction. But it was inspired by a real tragedy, one that was born of a deep and profound shame. To the man who inspired this story, a man I once loved, I hope that you have, in the years since, found a way to forgive yourself. I have found a way to forgive you. We all deserve a life free from the prison of our own secrets. Mark closed the book, and for the first time since that terrible night, he wept. They were not the tears of self-pity he had shed in the interrogation room. They were not the tears of shame he had shed in his prison cell. They were tears of a profound, cleansing grief. Grief for Sarah, for the pain he had caused her. Grief for the man he could have been. And grief for the love he had destroyed. Sarah's book was not a bestseller. It was a quiet, literary novel that found a small but appreciative audience. But for Sarah, its publication was a profound act of reclamation. She had taken the ugliest, most traumatic event of her life, and she had transformed it into art. She had taken control of her own narrative. She had found her own voice. She never saw Mark again. She never knew for sure if he had received the book. But it didn't matter. The book was not for him. It was for her. It was the final, closing chapter of that part of her life. Sarah Jensen's story is a tragic reminder that the most dangerous secrets are not the ones we keep from others, but the ones we keep from ourselves. Mark Brewer's life was a lie, but it was a lie he was desperate to believe in. He believed that if he played the part of a normal man well enough, he could become one. But the truth of his body, and the shame that had been ingrained in him since childhood, was a weight too heavy to be held up by a fiction. The wedding night was not just the end of a marriage. It was the violent, inevitable collapse of a lifetime of denial. Sarah, in the end, was not just a victim of his violence. She was a casualty of his war with himself, a war that had no winners, only survivors.